It's kind of like if the TV shows The X-Files and Stranger Things had a baby, and that TV baby grew up to be a big-budget Hollywood movie. That's right, today we're going to be talking about the 2018 sci-fi movie Annihilation, written and directed by Alex Garland, based on the novel by Jeff VanderMeer, and starring Natalie Portman as Lena, Jason Leigh as Ventress, and Gina Rodriguez as Anya Thorenson. Annihilation is rated R for violence, bloody imagery, language, and some sexuality. So in this nitty-gritty review for Annihilation, I'm going to be going through each category of my grid and talking in detail about what works and what doesn't. So this is going to for sure contain a bunch of spoilers. If you're looking for something spoiler-free, be sure to check out my itty-bitty review. Now that that's out of the way, the first category of the grid is going to be writing, plot, and genre. I really thought that Annihilation did an amazing job when it comes to genre. It's definitely a sci-fi movie, and a fairly hard sci-fi movie at that, but it definitely borrows from several other genres as well. It's filled with fantasy imagery, from the malignant plant formations that just cover the background, to the fantasy creatures, to even the shimmer itself, which is more reminiscent of, say, Asgard or even Narnia than a science-based phenomenon or a typical science fiction location. It also borrows fairly heavily from horror conventions, most notably in the scene where the bear returns and has Shepard's voice, and just that amazing scene was really full of more horror conventions than sci-fi. It also has elements of a more military action type film. Most notably, this is just going to come in the character appearances more than anything else. The outfits they wear definitely have the same kind of color schemes and styles as a traditional American Army uniform. And then of course they all are, carrying their guns, and they just look very military. And then you have this, you have Natalie Portman shooting the gun at the alligator or crocodile. So scenes like that definitely have more of an action feel to it. And yet I wouldn't say that this movie is at all a fantasy or a horror, and certainly not an action movie, despite having so many of these pretty strong elements borrowed from all of these different genres. It's almost like all of these different genre elements are refracted and reformed into something else, just like the shimmer itself does to everything inside of it. It was able to seamlessly just pluck certain elements out of a plethora of genres, but still keep it very much so a sci-fi movie. A lot like the crocodile had, a lot of mutations and had shark teeth and things like that, and yet it was still a crocodile. So I just really liked that about the genre, and I just thought that was really neat, because especially from the trailers, I definitely got the vibe that it was a sci-fi movie, but I was a little bit concerned because, you can see from the trailer it has the fantasy imagery, the action type scenes, and the horror. Like, it just seemed like such a amalgamation of all of these different genres, and I was worried it was going to be muddied and, one of those movies that just doesn't quite know what it is. And it was the exact opposite. This is definitely a movie that very much so knows what it is, and because it's so strongly rooted in this hard sci-fi genre, it can still borrow from these other genres without losing focus. So I thought that the genre conventions and tropes throughout the movie were just really strong and really well done, and one of the stronger aspects of a very strong script overall. As far as the actual plot structure goes, I thought this was a really solid film overall. I definitely like the way the flashbacks and the flash forwards work within the present of the movie to tell a more complex and layered story. The flashbacks are more the memories of Lena and Kane, and then, later Lena and Daniel. And then the flash forwards being the interrogation scenes with Lena and Lomax after she returns from the shimmer, and then the present being everything in between. So I really liked the way that these, different time periods were, you see just enough from each to really tell a layered story. With the flashbacks, at first we see a grieving wife who has lost her husband, and then throughout the course of the movie we see that a lot of that grief is guilt because she feels responsible because of the affair. So just the way that unfolded was really, really well done, and just the structure within the script there was really solid. And then even with the flash forwards, we learn right off the bat, what happened to Josie? I don't know. What happened to Ventress? I don't know. What happened to Shepard Cass? Well, she's dead. We get these hints of what happens throughout the movie, and yet it doesn't, it doesn't spoil anything. If anything, it, increases our intrigue of like, well, what happened? As far as the pace of this movie goes, this is definitely a slower paced movie, and I think for a lot of people it's going to be too slow, in the same way that, Blade Runner or Blade Runner 2049 is often criticized for being too slow, which I think is valid. If you're, if it's not resonating with you, or, you're just not interested in the themes being explored, then yeah, it's gonna feel too slow, and that's valid. I don't think it's fair to brush that off as, saying people, it's going over people's heads or they're not getting it. There's a difference between not getting something and having that thing not resonate with you. And I don't think this is a movie that's going to resonate with everybody. For me, though, the movie definitely resonated with me, and it had my attention. So I didn't think the pacing was too slow, but I recognize that for some people it might be. I think the only scene for me that maybe fell into that category of being a little bit too slow is going to be in the last act when we see Lena interacting with the alien being. I definitely thought it was a beautiful scene and really well done, but I don't think I quite understood the purpose of it, but then I went and saw it a second time because it is one of those movies that you're gonna want to see a second time, and that time that scene didn't feel too slow at all, and I think because I knew the ending of the movie and I knew, I had a little bit better grasp of the themes being explored throughout the movie, particularly the self-destruction and this idea that this creature that is, reacting to her and mimicking her is going to ultimately destroy her, or has the potential to ultimately destroy her. It just became a lot more interesting to me. So it became something more than just visually appealing upon a second viewing. I'll probably say this in every category. There's so much to unpack. It is such a layered film. But it's definitely one of those movies where each time you see it, I think things are going to make a little bit more sense, or you're going to see something in a little bit different way, or see something you didn't see before, and the layers are going to become a little bit more clear. So the total score for the writing, plot, and genre category is going to be a 9.4, which I consider to be great. It's not quite a perfect 10 out of 10, but it's really close. It's one of the stronger areas of a very strong movie overall, and I think it's very likely that with multiple viewings, my rating within this category is going to increase, because like I said, there's just so much going on, and when you start to understand a little bit more of what the script is doing, I think it's going to get stronger and stronger. So that's my score for now. With multiple viewings, I think it's very likely to increase. So the next category in the grid is also associated with writing, but this is going to be specific to characters. I think one of my favorite aspects within the characters of the movie is the way the internal needs of each character is explored. All of their outer goal is the same, to reach the lighthouse. A very simple, very straightforward outer goal. But then they each have a very specific internal need that drives them forward to that goal, and that ultimately leads to their destruction, which I think is just really interesting, and it was really well done. I think the most obvious example of this is going to come with the character of Anya Thorenson, who is the addict, and so her internal need is very closely associated with a need for control. And so, of course, once she gets in the shimmer, she's the one who's going to lose control. And every character has a similar character arc. Josie Radek is self-destructive in that she self-mutilated herself, and when Lena asks Shepard, she's tried to kill herself, and Shepard responds is, no, she wanted to feel alive. And then, once in the shimmer, she ends up, basically sprouting life from her scars. That need to feel alive turns into a different kind of life. And I thought that was just really beautifully done. She tells Lena, you want to fight whatever's in the lighthouse. Ventress wants to face it, and, she didn't want either of those things. You see Ventress, she faces what's in the lighthouse, and then, sure enough, Lena fights it and ends up fighting herself in the process. So there's just so much going on with all of their internal needs and all of their reasons for being in the shimmer, and their their self-destructive tendencies and how that plays out inside the Shimmer. It's just really beautifully executed, and some of the best use of outer goals versus internal needs I've seen in a movie in a long time. I also liked that the character of Shepard was quite literally the kind of emotional shepherd within this group of characters. She's the emotional rock within the whole movie. So of course she's the first one to die. The emotional compass throughout the movie, she's gone. I also really loved the dialogue throughout Annihilation. This is definitely one of those movies where every single thing that is said for a reason. There's, a deeper meaning behind every line, every conversation. You have the conversation with Lena and Cain where, she's arguing that God makes mistakes and he's saying he doesn't, and that's, a conversation that's very applicable to everything that's going on inside the Shimmer. And then you also have things like Ventress's speech about self-destruction and how that's, essentially laying out the theme of the whole movie, but in a very natural way and in a way that's, very specific to the character of Lena, and yet also very broad to the theme of the movie as a whole. So I thought that was really well written. And then even just little lines throughout the movie, it's one of those movies where there are no throwaway lines. Everything is said with purpose. Everything has a deeper meaning. There's layers to everything. So the dialogue overall was just really well done, and somehow also, managed to find that balance of, everything has a double meaning, everything has a deeper importance, and yet the dialogue still felt fairly natural. I do wish throughout the script we had gotten a little bit more character development. I felt that Lena and Ventress were both developed pretty much exactly as well as they should have been. We know exactly as much as we should about them, so I thought that the character development with those two characters was really well done. But I would have liked to see a little bit more with some of the secondary characters, Shepard Cass and Anya Thorenson and Josie Raddick. I just would have liked to know, or just get a chance to see a little bit more of their personalities and a little bit more of who they are as people. So that's just, that's one of the weaker areas within this category, but it's still a very strong category overall. I thought the characters were handled in really interesting ways, and they definitely, contributed to the overall themes and overall premise in ways that I think in sci-fi movies get lost a lot of times. The total score for the writing characters section is going to be an 8.5 out of 10, which is still great, though it's a little bit lower than the plot and genre category, mostly just because of the lack of development with some of the characters. But everything else was very strong, still well above average, and definitely in that great range. So the next category is going to be acting and casting. And I should probably say right away that I absolutely love Natalie Portman and think she's probably the most talented actor working in Hollywood right now, or at least easily top 10. So that said, I'm definitely biased towards liking her in general, but I did think that this was just a phenomenal performance. Just subtle things like the differences between her performance in the flashbacks, the present, and the flash forwards, through her facial expressions, through the way she delivers lines, through the way she moves her body, just everything about her performance just shifts a little bit between the flashbacks and then the present. And then again, it shifts a little bit more once we get to the flash forwards. It's a great performance from Natalie Portman in Annihilation. I have mixed feelings about Jennifer Jason Leigh's portrayal as Ventress. I thought in the first act, when we see her, before the Shimmer, I thought that worked really, really well. She just has that monotone delivery of lines and a, blank facial expression, but she has kind of a fidgetiness with the way she moves her hands that kind of gives an interesting layer to her character while still feeling, off-putting and like you just can't quite trust her. So I thought that worked really well. But then when we get into the Shimmer, I thought it was kind of 50-50 with whether it worked for me. So I'm kind of have slightly mixed feelings about her performance. Mostly I thought it was really good. I really liked Gina Rodriguez's performance as Anya Thorenson. When we get the scene where she's, losing it, she has everybody tied up in the chairs. Just her performance there was outstanding. Just that combination of extreme primal terror with distrust and paranoia, trying to logic her way out of it. Just a lot of different steps she goes through, and I just thought it was portrayed really well, and in such a way that we can empathize with her, despite the fact that she has our heroes tied to chairs and threatening to kill them. So I feel like in the hands of a lesser actor, that scene could have come off as cheap horror or something, you know, been there, done that, we've seen it in other things. But because she brought such depth to the performance, it really just took that scene to another level, and then really set us up for, you know, the second half of that scene where the bear comes back, which is, I'll get more into that in later categories, but it's one of the best scenes in a movie I've seen in a really long time. And her setting up that scene in the first half is part of what made the payoff so intense. I also really liked Tuva Novotny as Shepherd Cass. She really just seemed to just exude a maternal warmth in a lot of ways, particularly in the scene where it's her and Lena in the boat. It's similar to Gina Rodriguez in the scene I was talking about earlier. That's a scene that you know, in the hands of lesser actors, could have just come across as the most boring and blatant character exposition. But because she just has such a warmth and such genuine compassion and empathy for all of these characters, it just, I mean, that scene was just really, really elevated to one of the best in the movie, I think. So I really thought that her performance was amazing, and it was such that, you know, when she dies, it's, you know, a more emotional or more metaphorical loss of leadership and comfort and a mother figure. It's all of that, and all of that's in the script as well, but her performance just elevated it and really made it so that us as an audience just felt that loss. I also really liked Oscar Isaac throughout this movie, even in the scene early on in the movie where he comes back and he's talking to Lena right before the ambulance scene. He's very you know, definitely blank, monotone, expressionless, and it could have come off as very boring or just too weird or, you know, too off-putting. There was still something there that made us care about him, and I can't quite put my finger on what it was, but it was definitely something within the performance itself, and so I just thought he did a great job. I think the weakest performance throughout Annihilation is probably going to come with Tessa Thompson as Josie Raddick. I didn't think she did a bad job by any means. It was just a very passive performance. I would have liked to see just a little bit more strength and resolve within her character, but I still thought she did a good job overall. So before I wrap up the acting and casting category, I do want to note that I am aware that there is a controversy about the alleged whitewashing of the cast of Annihilation, and I talk about this quite a bit in my spoiler-free itty-bitty review, so if you're interested in that, or if you aren't aware of that controversy, I definitely suggest you check out my itty-bitty review. So for the acting and casting category overall, I gave Annihilation an 8.8 out of 10, which is great. So the next category in the grid is going to be lighting. I think Annihilation was just overall gorgeously lit. And I think with a movie like this, it would have been really easy to go overboard with the more, you know, cerebral or dreamlike or, you know, just more fantasy type lighting and give it more of a, you know, unnatural, unrealistic feel. But I thought Annihilation did a really good job of, you know, making everything look really, really beautiful and setting the mood, but also still maintaining that, you know, sense of realism. And I really think particularly for such a hard sci-fi movie that realistic lighting really helped tell the story. I also liked just the shimmer itself, which was probably, you know, had to have been largely added in post, if not all added in post. But just the way the atmosphere had that misty look to it with just a slight, you know, shimmer to it, or the, you know, when you see the swamp where the crocodile is and there's just a slight, almost like an oil slick on the water. I also liked that the flashbacks tended to have a warmer tone, almost a magic hour tone to it, while the flash forwards was definitely more cool and had almost an underground kind of feel to it. And then the present inside the shimmer was almost exclusively during the day, at least when they were outside. It was pretty much all during the day, and it was very, you know, very bright, very natural, and it still manages to feel very different than the flashbacks or the flash forwards, mostly just because it's outside and has more of a natural light, but still it has that contrast where you've got the warmer, the cooler, and the neutral. So I thought that was very effective in telling the story as well. The lighting in general just really hit all the right points of being, realistic while still setting the mood, helping tell the story, and just looking beautiful overall. So for the lighting category overall, I gave Annihilation a 9.2 out of 10, which is great. So the next category in the grid is going to be camera work. And like the lighting, I thought the camera work throughout Annihilation was just phenomenal and really hit just all the right points of being beautiful and helping to tell the story. It had a lot of really interesting compositions throughout. My favorite compositions throughout the movie, though, by far, is going to be the really claustrophobic framing that we see a couple of times throughout the movie. We first see it in a really intimate scene between Lena and Kane, which really takes on kind of a different meaning later in the movie when we learn she was having an affair at that point. But we see a lot of shots in that scene of, Lena, but half of her face is kind of covered by Kane's shoulder, and it's really, really tightly framed. He's blocking a lot of her face, and we get a lot of the scene shot that way. At the time, it feels very intimate, and then when we learn she's having an affair, it kind of takes on a different meaning of, her relationship with him and how she was feeling at that moment. And then we get a mirrored version of that at the end of the movie where, the alien is pressing her against the door, but is essentially just mirroring her movements. And we get a very similar shot where we see a portion of her face blocked by the alien's arm. It's very claustrophobic, and she's essentially suffocating. And as an audience, we can feel that tension and that just that claustrophobia, and it really mirrors that other scene, which is important because her relationship with Kane and her guilt over her affair is her form of self-destruction and her reason for being in the shimmer. And then we see essentially she's being destroyed by herself in that scene because, the alien is taking her form and mimicking her, and it's her own movements working against her. So just the symbolism of the framing itself was just phenomenal and really told a story in itself. And I just really, really liked the mirroring throughout the movie, and in general there's a lot of mirroring going on, but that in particular of comparing and contrasting the scene with her and Kane, and then the scene with her and the alien, and how there's a lot more similarities between those scenes than it seems on the surface. I also thought that when Lena finds Shepard's body, that was just one of the most beautifully shot scenes, particularly just the shot of Shepard's body. It's a devastating moment, and it's a disturbing image, and just the way it was framed and the coloring of it still had a beautiful aspect to it. So I thought that scene and particularly that shot was really well done. So for the camera work overall, I gave Annihilation a 9.3 out of 10, which again is going to be great. So the next category in the grid is going to be editing and special effects. Overall, I thought that Annihilation was really well edited. I liked the way the flashbacks and the flash forwards were interspersed throughout the narrative. Particularly, I liked that, when the second act begins and we enter the shimmer, the very first thing we see after the title card isn't the shimmer, but the sex scene with Lena that we later realize is with Daniel, not with Kane. So I just thought the placing and the length of that scene was really great, because we don't really realize why we're seeing that until much later in the film, when we learn that she's in the shimmer because she feels guilty over her affair with Daniel. So just the layers behind that I thought was really great. I also thought that the editor of Annihilation did a really good job of allowing shots to go on for longer than we would normally see, particularly because, like I said, this movie does borrow so much from horror and from, military action kind of movies, and both of those genres typically have faster edits and, a quicker pace. So I thought that the editing in that regard was really solid as well. I also really liked the montage of memories we see at the beginning of the movie. We see Lena in the room about to paint it, and we see her weeping, which, side note, Natalie Portman weeping is always a good way to break the audience's heart. But anyway, so we see her crying, and then we see this beautiful montage of scenes with her and Kane, And it, on the surface, it looks like a grieving widow who, has lost her husband. And then, it's only later on in the movie that we realize her association with those memories isn't just the loss of her husband, or even primarily the loss of her husband. It is more so the guilt that she feels because she thinks she is responsible for his death, because he found out about the affair. The special effects are also worth noting. The CGI isn't necessarily, photorealistic. Not being photorealistic kind of actually contributes to the cerebral, dreamlike feel of the movie overall. So it doesn't really hinder anything, and in fact, it helps the story overall, even though it's not photorealistic. And then we have the scene with the bear where, it probably would have been better to have, something with a little bit higher quality. But I still think that scene, it works overall. It did what it could do to the best of its ability with the, technology and budget available. And, through the sound design and the directing, just amplified that scene to a whole other level. So, the CGI isn't, it's not photorealistic, it's not Planet of the Apes, but it's still good special effects, and the stylization of the special effects contributes to the cerebral nature of the movie itself. So for the most part, even though it's not photorealistic, I thought the special effects worked really well, and when it was weaker, every other aspect of the movie helped to compensate for that. I also really liked the more subtle effects throughout the movie. I talked in lighting a little bit about how well the shimmer worked throughout. I'm sure, like I said, most, if not all of that was added in post. One scene that really stands out is when Lena first sees the shimmer and we see it reflected in her eyes. It's definitely noticeable, it's definitely there, but it's not as over the top as it probably could have been, and in a good way. I like that it's subtle. So I just thought that was a really beautiful addition to the special effects as well. So I gave the editing and special effects category overall a 9 out of 10, which again is great. So the next category in the grid is going to be aesthetics. And what I mean by aesthetics, I divide that up into character aesthetics, which is going to be hair, makeup, and costumes, and environmental aesthetics, which is going to be sets, props, and locations. So one thing that stands out as far as character aesthetics go, I really liked that when Lena is inside the shimmer, her hair and makeup and costumes all look a little bit different than when she's not in the shimmer. When she's in the shimmer, she wears her hair up, whereas her hair is worn down throughout the rest of the movie. And then even her clothes are different. She's wearing more of the almost military but not quite kind of style of clothing. So I thought that was just a nice touch, that just in the act of preparing to go into the shimmer, she starts to be different than what we've seen before. So I just thought that was kind of a nice touch. The sets and locations throughout were also just amazing. The forests are just absolutely gorgeous, and the way they were able to add the more fantasy imagery to it was just seamless and gorgeous. But that base they find instead, like just the set design there, it was just amazing. And the houses that they find, just the attention to detail, and just the way it's able to get a combination of feeling very homey and familiar while also feeling completely alien and terrifying. So there's just a great balance there, particularly within the shimmer of just alien and familiar at the same time, which I thought was just extremely effective. So for the aesthetics category overall, I gave Annihilation an 8.6 out of 10, which is going to be great. So the next category in the grid is going to be sound, and this is going to include the score and soundtrack, the sound mix, sound design, anything you hear included in this category. I really thought the score for Annihilation was absolutely incredible. It starts off with this really interesting blend of, like the long drawn out notes that kind of reminded me of, Blade Runner or Blade Runner 2049, that kind of almost metallic-y, very slow kind of compositions, but then, mixed in with a very folksy, homey kind of feel. And like I was saying with the sets and locations, I just had that really amazing blend of familiar and alien. It was just this great dichotomy that was present, within the visuals as well as within the score. As the movie progresses, and particularly as they enter the shimmer and get closer to the lighthouse, the more metallic-y, long notes starts to take over, and then the closer they get to the lighthouse, those long drawn-out notes start to get a little choppier, a little choppier, a little choppier. and by the end of the movie you have these compositions that are very complex, a lot going on, and it really feels like the songs themselves are being chopped up into their base parts, refracted, reformed into something new. I believe it's the song that plays during the end credits, where it really has like a almost static-y feel to it. It's phenomenal, just the way the score works within the story. You could, listen to the score from beginning to end and get just that same vibe of starting off as one thing, ending off as something else, and just the complexity of that score and the themes present just in the music of the movie is just phenomenal. I don't think I've ever seen a score work in quite the same way throughout a movie before, and in that regard, I would probably say this is the best score I've ever heard in a movie. I also think it's interesting to note that the composers for the movie, it's actually a team of two men who composed the score. So you have Ben Salisbury and Jeff Barrow. I've never seen two people work together as composers before. Aside from the soundtrack, the sound design and overall sound mix were also phenomenal. As far as the overall sound mix goes, it's a very quiet movie to the point that, you can, in the theater, you can hear every crunch of popcorn, every sip of soda, and even though it's definitely a movie that is good to see on the big screen with the surround sound and, good audio quality, that's definitely a great viewing experience, but the audience, not so much, because you can just hear everything because it's such a quiet movie, which isn't a bad thing. It's a great sound mix, but it's definitely the kind of movie where I'm excited for it to come out on home release so I can put headphones on, blast the sound, and just get sucked into the movie that way. But yeah, so for as quiet as the sound mix is, you can still hear everything that happens, every footstep, every paper rustling, every object moving. You can just hear everything, which makes the silence that much more important and that much more effective in the storytelling. There's just, a lot going on within the sound mix. For such a quiet movie, it's a very layered, very nuanced sound mix that really helps tell the story and really set that eerie mood throughout the movie. And then within the sound design, it was solid overall, but I think the most notable thing by far is going to come with the scene with the bear when it comes back after it's killed Cass. You have the roar of the bear, and you have the, obviously Cass's voice that's it's not modulated at all. It's just her voice mixed in with that roar, and just the layers that went into that sound design is probably the best sound design I've heard since seeing Jurassic Park for the first time and hearing that T-Rex roar. Something we haven't heard before, and just the way it was designed and layered, and it really is the biggest part of what made that scene so terrifying. And yeah, I could talk more about it for days, but I'll just leave it at that it was, some of the best sound design I've ever heard in a movie. So the overall score for sound design is going to be 10 out of 10 perfect. So the next category in my grade is going to be impact on film. And this one I divide up into 3 subcategories: critical impact, audience impact, and historical or inspirational impact. Now typically for the critical impact, I've been going to Rotten Tomatoes and kind of averaging out the tomato meter with the average score per review, but I've recently decided that, I'm just going to go to Metacritic. I think it does a much better job of coming up with a general critical consensus for a movie. So with that in mind, the Metacritic score for Annihilation as of the recording of this review was an 80, so I went ahead and just divided that by 10 and gave it an 8 out of 10 in that category. So for the audience score, I did just stick with Rotten Tomatoes, and I just kind of converted and averaged together the audience score with the average score per review. So the audience score was only a 66% with an average rating of 3.6 out of 5. So that kind of converted and averaged out to a 7 out of 10. So for historical and inspirational impact, I gave it a 7.5 out of 10. This does seem to be a movie that the audiences definitely aren't getting into nearly as much as the critics, but I do think this is going to be a movie that, people who like to study film or make films, people of that mindset are going to, I think this movie is going to resonate with them, and I think just the way the story is told is done in such an interesting way that I think it is going to inspire future storytellers to make these types of movies that the studios typically consider to be, too intellectual for average audience, moviegoers. And in fact, this movie is now notorious because there was a big upset between the producer and a studio exec, because the studio exec thought it was too intellectual and wanted to make changes, specifically change the ending and make Natalie Portman's character more relatable. And the producer, who had, final cut, disagreed, so we got thankfully we got the version we got. There still is, particularly with studios, a bias against these kind of movies because they're perceived as too intellectual or too high concept, or going over people's heads, things people can't relate with, etc., etc. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a movie that not only inspires filmmakers, but inspires studios to let filmmakers keep making movies like this. So the overall score for impact on film is going to average out to a 7.5 out of 10, which is still good, but is definitely the lowest score in the grid for Annihilation. And, it's the only score, the only category to score below great. So the next category in the grid is going to be overall enjoyment. And I gave Annihilation a 9.5 out of 10. I didn't give it a perfect 10, mostly because it's not necessarily the kind of movie that I would call enjoyable. I did have a good time watching it, and it's definitely a movie that I will watch over and over and over and over again, which is why I gave it such a high score in this category. But it's not necessarily, it's not a fun film. It's not, it's not Black Panther. It's not Thor Ragnarok. It's not that kind of a movie, which is part of why I like it so much. It's different, and it's new, and it's one you'll think about for a long time after seeing it, which is enjoyable in its own way. But it's just, it's not quite what I would call a perfectly enjoyable movie, and it does have a little bit of an issue with being a little bit slower paced, and particularly upon a first viewing, there was a little bit of a pacing issue, so that's another reason I didn't give it a perfect 10, even though I think that's an issue that's gonna go away with more and more viewings, and I do plan on seeing this movie more and more times. I also gave Annihilation 2 points of extra credit. I gave it 1 point of extra credit for being the kind of movie that, you just want to talk to people about and you can't stop thinking about it. It's just that kind of a movie. When I saw it the first time, as I was leaving the theater, these 2 elderly men who had seen the movie were asking me questions, what do you think happened at the end? How did you interpret this? And it was just a great experience. Though I did see it alone the first time I saw it, and so being able to have that interaction with other audience members, it's just, it's one of those movies where you want to ask as many people as you possibly can what they thought of it. To the point when I saw it the second time, I brought my boyfriend and one of our good friends, and I just wanted to hear what they had to say about it and ask them questions and just talk about the movie as much as possible and with as many different people as possible. So it's just that kind of movie, and so for that reason, I gave it 1 point of extra credit. I also gave it a half point of extra credit for kind of a similar reason, and that's for being the kind of movie that I want to see in theaters multiple times. I've already seen it twice. I really hope to see it at least a third time in theaters. And then I know once it comes out for home release, gonna buy it as soon as possible and watch it, at least once a year, just to refresh my memory, see what else I can get out of it, try and dissect all the layers. It's just that kind of movie, and, I definitely am the kind of person that likes to watch movies multiple times, but not usually in theaters. And usually if it is in theaters, it's going to be a movie like Black Panther or Thor Ragnarok, a more superhero kind of escapist movie that's just, I just want to have fun and re-experience that. And this is one of the rare examples of a movie that I want to go back to see, not because it was, escapist fun, but because, I just have to keep dissecting it. I have to keep pulling it apart. I have to keep, trying to find the next layer down and the next layer down and the next layer down. And it's just, you just can't get enough. You got to keep watching it and pulling it apart and, refracting it, if you will. And, there's always going to be more to it. So I definitely gave it a half point of extra credit for being, the kind of movie you want to see again and again and again. And I gave it 1 more half point of extra credit, just for the scene with the bear, because it was probably the most terrifying scene I've ever seen in a movie. I'm not the kind of person that gets scared in movies, and I wouldn't say I was scared in this movie. It's not like, I came home and had to turn all the lights on and sleep with the lights on, had nightmares, nothing like that. But but it definitely gave me goosebumps and I was just unsettled throughout that whole scene. And it's easily just one of the creepiest scenes I've seen in a movie probably ever. So yeah, so I had to give it a half point of extra credit, even though I already talked about it in a few of the categories as well. The total score for Annihilation is going to be a 91.8, which is a great movie. Like I keep saying, it's definitely the kind of movie you see over and over and over again and keep getting more out of. You know, there are elements of filmmaking throughout the movie, throughout every category of the grid that just contribute to, you know, not just the mood, not just the beauty, but the storytelling itself. And it's just, you know, such a layered movie and such a nuanced movie, and just a lot going on. And I really loved it. I think it's just phenomenal. As far as recommendations go, I definitely think it's the kind of movie that's not for everybody. And I think one of the biggest things is going to come within the genre. You know, if you like what I consider hard sci-fi movies like Arrival or the Blade Runner movies, you know, slower paced, a little longer, you know, very realistic, but also, you know, definitely sci-fi, very, you know, very large in scope, but very much so about humanity and human relations, things like that. You know, if you like those kind of movies, this is definitely one you need to go out and see, like, immediately. But if you know, think those other movies are too slow or boring or just doesn't, you know, if they don't resonate with you, then it's probably going to be the same with this one as well. It definitely explores very different themes than either of those examples given, but is still, like the Blade Runner movies and like Arrival, very much about humanity. And I actually think it would be a really phenomenal just movie watching experience to watch Arrival and then watch Annihilation back to back, because I think in a lot of ways they could be considered companion films. They're very different movies and they explore very different themes. But yeah, I think they could be considered companion films, and I look forward to, once Annihilation comes out, for home release, I really look forward to just making a day of it and watching them back to back and just seeing what I think after, because I think that would be an interesting experience. And yeah, that's about it. I will see you next week when I talk about Red Sparrow. Hey, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe to Griddy Films on YouTube by pressing this button. Also, like and share this video. You can follow Griddy Films on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for new video announcements, entertainment news, fun pics, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.